Okay. You have something to show?
I'm gonna just pull my book up on there.
Oh, okay. By the way, I haven't really made a big deal about this. I should probably make you guys aware that the Defender's website actually has a companion app. I know that a lot of people aren't really like interested in yet another app. But there is an app you can install called Moodle that
Moodle?
Moodle.
Okay.
If you're interested, you definitely don't have to do this. It's not necessary. But it basically connects to the Defender's website, and like you can download and access the content. Just maybe make things a little easier. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out there, make you aware if you're interested in it. So this week's article was interesting. I had to read it multiple times. I hope it was edifying, but it was a bit more abstract than expected. What were your thoughts? Were there any questions or comments on the essay?
Well, it was far above me in many ways.
I don't think you're alone.
One time, I will say that.
I don't think you're alone. There were a lot of things that were.
I was thinking he was going to talk when they were talking about a perpetual motion machine. That he might spend a little more. But I had to at the end think, now how did this have to do with evolutionary computation? The more he went into numbers and the atoms and on and on, and I came to the conclusion that what he's saying is evolution just can't happen mathematically. Is that the summary of what he's saying?
Well, so he didn't make his point super clear. I think it would be reasonable to make that assertion, but I think more indirectly he was making a criticism of an origin of life rather than evolution. But evolutionary computation, the name, I think, draws too much attention to Darwinian evolution, when it's really not so much about that, I don't think. This actually has very material relevance to us today because of developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning and things like that. Evolutionary computation is far more abstract and somewhat academic than it is pragmatic or practical, I think. So, like, after reading it a couple of times, the realization that I came to was that this isn't so much of a critique on the plausibility of Darwinian evolution as I think it is more of a criticism of origin of life, right? Because the points that he was making, particularly about like the need for implicit information. He was talking about like the King James Bible, Moby Dick, Grimm's fairy tales.
Oh yeah.
And like randomly, the myth of the monkeys at the typewriter. Theoretically plausible that if enough monkeys pound out random letters for a long enough time, all of the great texts in history, such as Moby Dick, Grimm's fairy tales, and the King James Bible, would eventually result. So it's plausible, assuming that you already have the monkeys and you already have the typewriters, right? So I think really the more concerning issue here is the origin of life and not so much biological evolution. I asked Randy to bring theistic evolution because, believe it or not, there are some people who are Christian and believe in evolution. They're theistic evolutionists. I think the title of that book is terribly unfortunate because the book is not itself about theistic evolution as much as it is critiquing theistic evolution. So the title, Theistic Evolution...
That should have been big and that should have been small.
Yeah, it kind of leads you to believe that this book is like supporting theistic evolution when really it's more criticizing and kind of dismantling theistic evolution. But anyway...
my thought on the article was that it was more instructive on mathematics.
Yeah, yeah.
It was just kind of showing the limits of mathematics and what it can do and what what the possibilities versus the probabilities.
Yeah, that's an
and,
interesting point.
And looking at that.
Yeah.
Because I think that, with the monkey problem, yeah, it's possible, but it's unlikely in the absurd.
Well, it's theoretically possible, but not actually possible.
Yeah.
Kind of like Hilbert's Hotel. Theoretically, infinity is possible, but actual infinity is not.
What was that?
Hilbert's Hotel. So we talked about it. Maybe that's what I should have shown. Maybe we could show it on your laptop. Hilbert's Hotel is.
You don't have an HDMI cable, right?
No, I didn't bring connections. Hilbert's Hotel is a thought experiment proposed by Hilbert. What was his first name? German. I think he's a German mathematician. Anyway, it was a thought experiment to show that an actually infinite number of things is not possible. So while in math we talk about infinity, we kind of juggle around this concept of infinity. In the real world, in the physical world, an actual number of infinite things is not possible. So similarly, Scott was saying that the author here, Robert Marx, was saying that while evolutionary computation is theoretically possible, it's not actually possible in the physical world. So hopefully we can show you that video, but just to summarize, in Hilbert's Hotel, the idea is that imagine an infinite hotel, literally a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And every single room is occupied. From room number 1 to room N. The whole hotel is completely full. And a guest shows up and the night manager says, sure, yeah, we can give you a room. And they're like, but every room is full. And the night manager says, no worries. Here, we'll just send person in room number 1 to room number 2, person in room number 2 to room number 3, room number 3 to room number 4, and so on and so forth. So everybody who's in room N will go into room N plus 1. So you started with a full hotel and you just added one person to the hotel. Now you've got a full hotel still. So it's absurd. And he goes on to give other examples of how, now you got, say, an infinite bus that shows up, and an infinite number of guests wants to check into the infinitely full Hilbert's Hotel. And the night manager says, oh, sure, yeah, no problem. We can, we'll get you in here. And so he figures out a way to get an infinite number of guests into the infinite hotel, which is already full. So infinity plus infinity equals infinity. So the idea is that in the real world, these imaginary concepts are not applicable. They're more just abstract concepts than they are practical, applicable ideas.
Well, the math equations that he showed just showed that it's just can't happen. I mean, it was just too big of a number to even be possible.
Right.
Well, and I think that too, that he showed that in the use of that, it's deceptive because they control the parameters and control the search space.
Oh,
and
yeah.
control all of these aspects, which in the ability to do that makes it a useful tool, but those are artificial constraints.
Mm-hmm.
And without the constraints, it's absurd, and it's infinite or just an utter impossibility.
That example when he talks about the monkeys typing on the typewriter,
Mm-hmm.
I thought they also use that in here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very common
Right.
example or model.
There we go, finally. Okay, so there are several videos explaining Hilbert's Hotel. Maybe we'll do the TED video. Oh, we're mirroring. I see. Okay. I'll get through an ad first here. We got volume on the TV.
About
Oh, yeah, there we go. Okay.
In the 1920s, the German mathematician David Hilbert
David.
devised a famous thought experiment to show us just how hard it is to wrap our minds around the concept of infinity. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms and a very hard-working night manager. One night, the infinite hotel is completely full, totally booked up with an infinite number of guests. A man walks into the hotel and asks for a room. Rather than turn him down, the night manager decides to make room for him. How? Easy. He asks the guest in room number 1 to move to room 2, the guest in room 2 to move to room 3, and so on. Every guest moves from room number n to room number n plus 1. Since there are an infinite number of rooms, there is a new room for each existing guest. This leaves room 1 open for the new customer. The process can be repeated for any finite number of new guests. If, say, a tour bus unloads 40 new people looking for rooms, then every existing guest just moves from room number n to room number n plus 40, thus opening up the first 40 rooms. But now, an infinitely large bus with a countably infinite number of passengers pulls up to rent rooms. Countably infinite is the key. Now, the infinite bus of infinite passengers perplexes the night manager at first, but he realizes there's a way to place each new person. He asks the guest in room 1 to move to room 2. He then asks the guest in room 2 to move to room 4, the guest in room 3 to move to room 6, and so on. Each current guest moves from room number n to room number 2n, filling up only the infinite even-numbered rooms. By doing this, he has now emptied all of the infinitely many odd-numbered rooms, which are then taken by the people filing off the infinite bus. Everyone's happy, and the hotel's business is booming more than ever. Well, actually, it is booming exactly the same amount as ever, banking an infinite number of dollars a night. Word spreads about this incredible hotel. People pour in from far and wide. One night, the unthinkable happens. The night manager looks outside and sees an infinite line of infinitely large buses, each with a countably infinite number of passengers. What can he do? If he cannot find rooms for them, the hotel will lose out on an infinite amount of money, and he will surely lose his job. Luckily, he remembers that around the year 300 BCE, Euclid proved that there is an infinite quantity of prime numbers. So to accomplish this seemingly impossible task of finding infinite beds for infinite buses of infinite weary travelers, the night manager assigns every current guest to the first prime number, 2, raised to the power of their current room number. So the current occupant of room number 7 goes to room number 2 to the 7th power, which is room 128. The night manager then takes the people on the first of the infinite buses and assigns them to the room number of the next prime, 3, raised to the power of their seat number on the bus. So the person in seat number 7 on the first bus goes to room number 3 to the 7th power, or room number 2187. This continues for all of the first bus. The passengers on the second bus are assigned powers of the next prime, 5. The following bus, powers of 7. Each bus follows powers of 11, powers of 13, powers of 17, etc. Since each of these numbers only has 1 and the natural number powers of their prime number base as factors, there are no overlapping room numbers. All the bus's passengers fan out into rooms using unique room assignment schemes based on unique prime numbers. In this way, the night manager can accommodate every passenger on every bus, although there will be many rooms that go unfilled, like room 6, since 6 is not a power of any prime number. Luckily, his bosses weren't very good in math, so his job is safe. The night manager's strategies are only possible because while the infinite hotel is certainly a logistical nightmare, it only deals with the lowest level of infinity, namely the countable infinity of the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Georg Cantor called this level of infinity Aleph 0. We use natural numbers for the room numbers as well as the seat numbers on the buses. If we were dealing with higher orders of infinity, such as that of the real numbers, these structured strategies would no longer be possible, as we have no way to systematically include every number. The real number infinite hotel has negative number rooms in the basement, fractional rooms, so the guy in room 1/2 always suspects he has less room than the guy in room 1. Square root rooms, like room radical 2, and room pi, where the guests expect free dessert. What self-respecting night manager would ever want to work there, even for an infinite salary? But over at Hilbert's Infinite Hotel, where there's never any vacancy and always room for more, the scenarios faced by the ever-diligent and maybe too hospitable night manager serve to remind us of just how hard it is for our relatively finite minds to grasp a concept as large as infinity. Maybe you can help tackle these problems after a good night's sleep, but honestly, we might need you to change rooms at 2 a.m.
So the idea here is that infinity is one of those things that's theoretically possible, but it's not actually possible. Dr. Craig makes that point in the Kalam cosmological argument, has implications for that argument. Where is it?
Now, what was the countability infinity? What
Countable infinity.
Types of infinities. So we're talking about the lowest level of infinity, which is that of countable numbers, whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth.
That was a more thorough explanation than I've heard before that
Yes, that's a
in
better
the
one.
past.
Here's the
And that's called Hilbert's, H-I-L?
Yeah, Hilberts. They talk about it here in the cosmological argument. In fact, this is David Hilbert himself saying the infinite is nowhere to be found. It just doesn't exist in real life. It's not a thing.
Infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. It's today. So the number of events leading up to today could not possibly be infinite. The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality.
It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play
is solely that of an idea. What objections might be?
Where is it? Yeah, here in this video they talk about Hilbert's Hotel for the cosmological argument.
It gets even crazier when the guests start to check out. Suppose all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead, all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left. And yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus, we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers. These absurdities show that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in the real world.
So the argument that's being made here is the cosmological argument, the idea that the universe had to have a beginning. The universe began to exist, and if the universe began to exist, then it must have had a cause, because it's absurd to assume that the universe caused itself. But that's not the topic at hand. The topic is just simply the evolutionary computation. I think what the author here is doing is showing that while this is all theoretically plausible, theoretically conceivable, it's not actually possible, right? Just like the Hilbert's Hotel. We can pontificate about these concepts, but is it even possible for it to apply in the actual universe? And so that's why I said I don't think that this is so much a critique on evolution, while it is discussing evolutionary computation. I think it's more of a criticism of origin of life. Spontaneous abiogenesis, like getting life from non-life. Because I think Darwinian evolutionists have to make the concession that life just emerged spontaneously, randomly. And so that's what this evolutionary computation is all about, is how do we get desirable results randomly, right? So like I think the purpose of comparing Moby Dick and Grimm's fairy tales and the King James Bible, those are very complex works that would be incredibly unlikely to emerge randomly. And so I think implicit in that is to compare that to the complexity of, say, a human body part, or even just something as simple as a plant like grass. These biological machines that have this complexity, this order of self-replicating. So I think that was kind of the point implicit in that, but he never explicitly says, consider the odds of this happening versus the odds of, life emerging and life such that it could develop into birds and fish and humans.
Like I said, it seems to me like it was more a teaching exercise for mathematics and huge numbers and that sort of thing, and probabilities. It was interesting. I did just a little deal. Most contentions of the first, most ideas of what the first living cell would have looked like include roughly 100,000 base pairs. And so there are 4 amino acids. So you take 4 to the 100th power, and I plugged that into several mathematical deals on the computer, and it just said infinity. And that's absolute minimum.
Right.
I mean, that's not including the proteins needed, all the different
Minimum
aspects.
complexity.
I mean, absolute minimum complexity.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
just at infinity. If you include, the 100 different proteins needed for that first cell, you would have the 4 to the 100th power, and then there's 20 amino acids times raised to the 100th power, and that would be the exponent of the 4 to the 100th power. So I mean, that's infinity toward raised to the infinity. So I mean,
Now I forget my math, so if you have 100 amino acids and there's 4 combinations, you take it 4 to the 100th power?
no, it's backwards. There's 4
Proteins. Or
4 bases.
Or 4 bases?
4 bases, and then there's 100 different spots on the, or 100,000 spots of these base pairs. So that would be 4 to the 100,000th power.
So 4 times 4 times 4 times 4 times 4 times 4 times 4, 100,000 times.
Okay.
Right, so here we're not really talking about evolution as much as we're talking about how we get life from non-life. And the kind of the concession or the assumption that you have to make that would have had to have happened just purely by chance. The other reason I don't think he's actually criticizing evolution as much as he is origin of life is that if he were criticizing evolution, then this would be totally disanalogous to make the analogies of, say, Moby Dick, Grimm's fairy tales, or even just the egg, the boiling egg recipe. Because as I was reading the egg boiling recipe, it's like, this has nothing to do with evolution, because in the egg boiling recipe, the desirability or the fitness of the result is purely subjective, because he's talking about how, there's a part where he's like, knowledge of chemistry. Here is it. For example, the knowledge of chemistry tells us that placing boiled eggs in cold water retards the chemical reaction that will ultimately make the eggs smell like sulfur. Assuming sulfur smell will detract from fitness. Assuming sulfur smell will detract from fitness. Well, that's subjective, and I think it's disanalogous from biological evolution, because in evolution, it's not a matter of like what's better, what's not. It's just a matter of like who lives and who doesn't. So like that's totally disanalogous. But then I realized, well, he's not talking about evolution. He's talking about He's talking about origin of life, because in origin of life, either you have life or you don't.
Yeah. And the one thing too that is I've thought about too in regard to that is the search space is, or let me see, how do I put this? He's assuming that there's an infinite number of, in mathematics, there's an infinite number of possibilities, an infinite number of attempts, an infinite number of raw materials, basically, put into the equation.
Yeah.
In real life, we've never proven that there were any of the building blocks that make up a cell. There's never been any proof. I mean, you could look at what was the guy's name that produced the amino acids in the 50s?
You're talking about Crick and Watson?
Yeah.
No, that was DNA.
That was DNA. But anyway, they made some real out there assumptions as to the initial conditions, and they were able to produce a few amino acids, but we don't even know that was possible.
Didn't they after that find out that there wasn't the hydrogen or helium or something content that they thought there was? Or
Yeah, exactly.
we talked, that was in one of our lessons, wasn't it? About how that experiment from the 50s was disproved somewhere in the 80s or something like that.
Because of different initial conditions.
I don't recall that. Was that in the origin of life?
I don't remember where that was, but I wouldn't have thought of it by myself.
Yeah, I think it was Origin Life. It was one of the films we had, one of the videos.
Oh, yeah, it might have been what was the film that Randy showed?
The Truth Project?
Yeah, Truth Project. It might have been that. It might have been Truth Project.
Yeah.
So if nothing else, I hope that this was edifying, at least in like kind of an introduction to computer science, but also a challenging exercise in critical thinking. Or at least that's how it was for me. It was an exercise in critical thinking, because he never really makes his point explicit. Like even in the conclusion, he's just saying search spaces require structuring for search algorithms to be viable. This includes evolutionary search for a targeted design goal. Well, that's assuming that there is a targeted design goal, which Darwinian evolution makes no claim about a design goal.
It excludes it, actually.
Right, it excludes it, exactly. So the added structure information needs to be implicitly infused into the search space and is used to guide the process to a desired result. The target can be specific, as is the case with the precisely identified phrase, or it can be in general, such as meaningful phrases that will pass, say, a spelling or grammar check. In any case, there is yet no perpetual machine for the design of information arising from evolutionary computation. There seemed to be like some underlying point that's not being made explicit. I wasn't sure what it was.
So there's a section in this book that's the beefed up version of that.
Is it written by the same guy?
Let's see. This is Winston Ewart.
No, it's Marx.
What is targeted design goal? You said evolution is not, you two agreed on something there.
Yeah,
I
targeted
totally
design
didn't
goal,
understand
that means so like in the case of the boiled egg, that means we want to make the best tasting egg. Like that's the goal. Targeted design goal means we have an intended result.
Okay,
But Darwinian evolution not only doesn't have that, but as Scott pointed out, it excludes that. It doesn't have a goal. It doesn't have an intention. It's totally blind. It's just randomly shooting at things, and the filter, if you will, is fitness, like survival, like the outcomes that have certain traits will survive in the wild, survive predators, it'll survive, the harsh elements, weather, temperature, time, etc. So it's not like there's any kind of specific intentionality. There's not a goal that it's trying to work toward, because the idea of Darwinian evolution is that it's completely blind, and the only change that results is that which manages to avoid getting eaten or frozen to death or struck by lightning or whatever, survival of the fittest rather. Like Darwinian evolution excludes a target, a goal, intentionality. There's no intentionality. It's completely blind.
Yeah, so this chapter I think did a good job of explaining how ridiculous it is. With the numbers and what it would take mathematically, they say evolutionists and theistic evolutionists will claim that evolution is possible. It's just a matter of time and chance and mutations and change. So they'll use computer simulations in the defense of Darwinian evolution. We can see here that using computer simulations to produce an end result, something that's what they're looking for. So in the example of the King James Bible, what would it take to write the King James Bible, just the monkeys typing on it? Well, there's a couple things wrong with that. One, John mentioned, you're already assuming monkeys and all the stuff in the beginning. But imagine those are there. The numbers, you can compute a number that's forever infinite long, but that doesn't mean that it's possible in real life. But there's because they use computer simulations, right, to defend it. So this is just talking, it's almost like an argument against and a critique on it, I would say. Because Darwinian evolution itself offers no predictions of computer simulations. So they call it unfalsifiable theory. Kind of like if you were to say, others bring in a tree, so that tells me it has age. Well, I can have another theory that says God created that tree last week with the appearance of age. My claim is unfalsifiable. You can't find another claim to prove it wrong. So
I also think it's a little bit disanalogous to talk about the monkeys and the typewriters, because I think in that illustration, what you're trying to do is you're trying to go from 0 to 100%. Like trying to go, like with the King James Bible, for example, you're making the assumption that the process is starting from absolute nothing and then resulting in the King James Bible. And that's not really what evolution says. Evolution is, perhaps if we tweak the analogy, evolution would say that you've got some of the King James Bible, but over time, it gradually, grows closer and closer to what we consider the King James Bible. And the ones that have spelling mistakes or, the wrong words here and there, they don't get republished, they don't get reproduced, and so those just kind of self-filter, they kind of self-resolve, and so it eventually works toward, given enough time and resources, it works toward the King James Bible. So I think it would be a mistake to consider this illustration as going from absolute nothing to a complete, King James Bible, like in one step. Like it does happen over lots and lots and lots and lots of steps, but I think it's more of a critique on the origin of life, because the first step, getting anywhere, like in the essay, he talks about, just getting the words "in the beginning," like that. I think is perfectly analogous to origin of life, because it's just like, the collection of the 4 base amino acids to begin forming DNA, which would, then eventually result in self-replicating structures and cells and things like that. So it seemed like it was more of a critique on origin of life than Darwinian evolution, because, like I said, there were so many aspects of this that have nothing to do with Darwinian evolution, because it's like, well, Darwinian evolution isn't like that. Like with the eggs, for example, boiling an egg, the design goal is to have a good tasting boiled egg. But in evolution, it's like, well, it doesn't matter. We will try all of the recipes of the eggs, and whichever one just happens to
Get lucky.
Yeah, get lucky and keep getting remade over and over and over. Well, that just happens to be the best one. So there isn't an intelligence, imparting or imposing, a will or an intentionality on the result.
So this says Darwinian, instead computer simulations of evolution reduce Darwinian evolution to its essence, and then observe the resulting process. So they say what's the essence of Darwinian evolution? According to philosopher Daniel Dennett, evolution will occur whenever and wherever 3 conditions are met: replication, variation, which is mutation, and differential fitness or competition. So though they use computer simulations as a tool to kind of look at, is it possible for evolution to happen, given, and they'll just use examples with predetermined stuff they plug in, and even with that, they'll claim it's possible, but if you look at the whole thing as a whole, well, what do? They plugged in information, intelligent information with design criteria and this, to get an end result. How did they knew what they wanted as the end result. So
That's a good point.
They try to use, it works. We put it in a computer and simulate it, and this just takes this much time to do this or whatever. But real evolution's unguided, completely unguided.
I suppose now that you say that does kind of lead me to wonder, maybe he is talking about evolution by saying that in the comparison with the King James Bible, the amount of time and resources that it would take to result in just the first, 4 or 5 words in the beginning, the first 4 words, the amount of time and resources it would require just to result in that alone. Assuming, let's be incredibly charitable. We'll be as charitable as we can and assume that origin of life has already taken place. We'll just disregard. Yeah, we'll just disregard that. Like, who cares how it happened? Let's say that's already happened, and we just want to get in the beginning, randomly. That in itself would take so much time and resources that doesn't line up with what we observe in our universe. Like, the age of our universe is insufficient to arrive at that result, even just that result.
That's what I was thinking.
Let alone the complexity that we actually observe, like, plants and animals and humans and things like that. So maybe that's a better way to put it, is that making those charitable assumptions we still, there's just not enough time to even arrive at such a rudimentary result, let alone what we actually observe.
Again, it helps prove the point that, or help show that how incredibly complex life is. The amount of time it would take is, there is an amount of time it would take. It's infinite.
Well, it's so much greater than the amount of time that has actually passed.
Well, and time isn't the friend that they make it out to be.
Yeah,
Because,
that's a good point.
There's something called entropy, which degrades everything in the universe. And it's one of the most fundamental laws in all of science, all of physics. And it says that everything will deteriorate over time.
So it's an uphill battle.
Yeah. And so, the more time you have, the more entropy you have. And therefore, the whole concept of evolution goes against one of the most fundamental laws in all of the universe. And, there's things like oxidation and, radiative degradation and solubility and, all of these different things. And the general trajectory is towards disorder instead of order. And so, time is used as an excuse, but actually time is a destroyer.
That's an interesting point. I have never considered that. That's a really good point. Because time taken in isolation is friendly, sure, but that's a naive way to look at it because time brings with it so many other factors like entropy. Yeah, that's a good point. I've never thought about it that way, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, the computer simulations they use are so simple and unrealistic because you have things like that. Things that are going to break apart the cell and all kinds of factors that they can't think of over the millions of years that they're calculating. There's so many variables, it's uncalculable. It makes no sense. Like they use just 26 letters for their example. So Richard Dawkins actually does the same thing. It's called Dawkins, they call it Dawkins Weasel. So he uses computer simulations. Richard Dawkins, is one of the famous atheists. He uses computer simulation to see how long it will take to produce the phrase, I think I'm a weasel, or I think it's a weasel. So it's similar to the King James analogy they're using here. But this book really breaks it down. Why are you only using 26 letters and not punctuations and numbers and symbols and everything else?
Emojis.
Yeah. If we look at life, it's way more complex. A protein can be hundreds of amino acids long, tens of hundreds, like huge. And then within those amino acids, you have left and right hand versions of those. And they all have to be left hand versions. If you're saying a right hand version, it doesn't work.
And 1 in 14 trillion are useful.
Yeah.
Not to mention.
So
1 in 14 trillion, what are useful?
Proteins. The possible combination of amino acids to form a protein. Only one in it's been estimated. Only 1 in 14 trillion actually produces a useful foldable protein.
So actual real illustrations of what it takes to make proteins and proteins to life and DNA, that's a huge leap because there's a whole lot there with the DNA and everything as that, but it's you can't calculate it. You can't put that in a computer model. Yet they're saying, oh yeah, evolution's real, and we could prove it with a simulation using these super simplified things.
One of the things that goes back to the thing that we need to remember as Christians is people tend to use and abuse the word evolution because when they say evolution, maybe our first response should be, well, what do you mean by evolution? Because I think a lot of people like to use the word evolution just as a placeholder word for change, which, yeah, change happens, but I think evolution, like in its truest, honest, most honest sense, has implications for origin of life. It's not just simply change. Because if you're going to use the word evolution just to refer to any broad change, period, well then yeah, I'm an evolutionist. Of course. I mean, you can observe change with breeding of dogs or cats or plants. Or, like my wife planted these delicata squashes and harvested a whole bunch of them, and they're all spaghetti squash in size. Like what? But because she planted spaghetti squash last season, the DNA interacted and a new result happened. So
Hybridization.
maybe it's best to try to get that out of the way first. Like when you're having a conversation with someone about the plausibility and observability of evolution, just what do you mean by evolution? Do you mean change? Because if we're just talking about change, then yeah, of course, change happens. Like we see it all the time. But when you're talking about Darwinian evolution as like the origin of life, there's so much more to it than just change.
And that's good because you have within evolution itself, they have micro and macro, so some small changes and huge species changes. All of that's a moot point if you can't explain what they call abiogenesis, which is
The origin of life.
the origin of life.
Yeah.
And it's called abiogenesis.
Yeah, abiogenesis means you get life from non-life.
How do you spell that?
ABIO
Genesis.
Genesis, yeah.
ABIO Genesis.
GENESIS?
Yep.
Yeah, and one thing, too, I think that one thing that Darwin did get right is natural selection. We see that very commonly, and breeding of dogs is a controlled process of that. We've taken intelligence and we've manipulated the genetics to produce the selective change over time, and that was probably his most brilliant piece of work. But that doesn't explain major morphological changes, major organ and structure changes. It definitely has very defined limits. And like Randy said, the implication, if we go back, is abiogenesis, which is just an absolutely insurmountable challenge that nobody has ever adequately or even lots of people have attempted to explain it, and no one has even come close.
And even in that, when you have natural selection and these different species, and you get different results, it's working with existing DNA, with existing information. It's not
Right.
producing new information and new DNA. It's taking what's already there and just using different parts of it.
Well, and in addition to that, yeah, that's a very good point. In addition to that, natural selection destroys diversity in DNA, which very few people recognize or admit, because natural selection destroys the variety of DNA and selects a narrowing path through natural selection.
Yeah.
That make sense?
No.
So say we'll use people as an example. Let's say thousands of years ago there was all kinds of different people, more than we have today, more than the 100 or however different, Asian, African, European, German, all of them, way more. But there was one species that just dominated the world and killed off the majority of them, and now they're the dominating economic class, or we'll just use Russians or whatever. that part of the world, and they produce, and so everybody now is an offspring of them. There was more genetic information. You had all those other thousands of different types of people, different DNA. They're gone because survival of the fittest. These group of people over here killed everybody else, and now it's just their offspring. So how?
Let's see. I mean, a little, another explanation. You have, okay, say eight different subspecies of dogs. Okay. Now we start blending them together, and we end up with a poodle. Okay. Now you can take another set of these eight different species and make a poodle. Okay. But you can't take a poodle and keep breeding them and end up with these 8 different dog species, subspecies, because that genetic material was selected out, and therefore that no longer exists in the poodle genome. And so you can't go backwards because that material has been selected out and been lost.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a way to draw like the tree of life. So there's a couple different common ideas about evolution, one of them being universal common descent, meaning everything, every plant and animal came from a common ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
There's some now that believe that that's just not possible with the abrupt emergence of life in different time periods.
And the octopus.
Yeah.
The octopus is very unique.
So they just go, okay, well maybe there's just multiple trees of life. But to his example, if you have I want to start from up here. So if you have like, if these are all the different breeds of dog, if they have a common ancestor up here, so if you have like the poodle, Labrador, Chihuahua, Rottweiler, so on and so forth. If they all come from a common ancestor, that means this common ancestor has to have all the same DNA as these down here.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a Chihuahua over here, and we have a Great Dane over here, can we ever take 2 Chihuahuas and breed them to infinity to get a Great Dane?
Mm-mm.
No. That's because there's a loss of information. That all used to be in one ancestor here, but over the course of time of selective breeding, Chihuahuas can only create Chihuahuas now. And Great Danes can only create Great Danes. So that's a selective breeding with a loss of information. Of course, this is oversimplified, this is over thousands of millions of years, they say. But does that kind of help?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So the bigger question maybe that would be worth considering is, what does all this have to do with apologetics and Christianity and God and the Bible and all that? A lot of people will try to use evolution as evidence that we don't need to posit God, and I think that's genuinely why many atheists cling so hard to evolution, is that it serves as it has explanatory power for things that they would argue Christians just say, oh, well, it was just God. So in their mind, they call it God of the gaps. Have we talked about God of the gaps?
Yeah.
No,
We have discussed it, or mentioned it anyway, but
not in this class.
So God of the gaps is a catchphrase that refers to what atheists and even some agnostics would say is intellectually irresponsible behavior on the part of a Christian. And that is, anything you can't explain, you just say, oh, it was God. So like wherever there are gaps in knowledge, just fill it in with God. We don't know where the universe came from, it must have been God. We don't know where life came from, it must have been God. And I would agree that it is very intellectually irresponsible. However, I don't think that that's an honest look or an honest picture of Christianity. So evolution, many people would try to use evolution to fill in that gap and say, well, Christians just use God of the gap, so you can't explain it, so you just say it's God. But I'm a more intellectually responsible person, so therefore I do have an explanation, and it's evolution. So the idea then, or the question, I guess, then becomes, are God and evolution compatible with each other? Assuming that evolution is even true, which it may or may not be. Are the existence of God and Darwinian evolution mutually exclusive, like either one is true or the other is true? Do you think that's the case?
Do I?
Yeah. Do you think it's true that either God exists or evolution is true? And if evolution is true, then God can't exist. Or if God does exist, then evolution can't be true. Are they mutually exclusive, do you think?
Well, I think they're mutually exclusive in the sense that, what did you call it? Abiogenesis?
Abiogenesis.
Abiogenesis, we don't get life from non-life. So I'd go back to that premise and say, no, there's no evolution because you can't do that. So therefore there's a God.
Well, so theistic evolutionists would argue that abiogenesis happened by divine intervention. God caused a miracle to happen, and abiogenesis just happened.
But they're saying there's a God.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why I'm saying, I guess the answer to my question, to answer my own question, is I don't think that evolution and theism are mutually exclusive. I think that theistic evolution could be true. I don't believe in it, but I just don't want to go so far as to say that either you believe in God or you believe in evolution. I think that's just silly to say that, either one is true, but they can't both be true. They can both be true. I don't believe that, but I don't think that being a Christian means that you have to reject evolution. That's all.
I'm going to throw something out there. I think it depends on your definition of evolution.
That's true too, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
a very strict definition of evolution excludes God completely, and I think that is impossible.
How so?
Abiogenesis.
Well, right,
It's
but I mean,
absolutely impossible.
but the
without
theistic,
God.
right, the theistic
No, not
evolutionists.
theistic evolution.
Well,
I mean,
that's a big
a textbook definition of evolution excludes God.
I guess because it would make the assumption that abiogenesis is not a miracle. It does
Right.
somehow happen within the laws of nature. Yeah, I suppose so.
So, I mean, somewhat it's a matter of semantics,
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, that's all this book talks about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm going to address the theological critique of theistic evolution, just the topic headings. So, theistic evolution undermines 12 creation events and several crucial Christian doctrines. Theistic evolution is incompatible with the teachings of the Old Testament. Theistic evolution is incompatible with the teaching of the New Testament. It's incompatible with the historical Christian doctrine, and did not. Those are just 4.
Those are the headings.
Those are just the headings.
Yeah, so that giant chunker of a book is actually kind of similar to our Evidence for God in the sense that it's a compilation of essays. I would be interested in reading that, like doing a study on that. I don't know if we would be able to do that like soon. Maybe someday if we can get enough people interested in it. But
My wife was a widow for, a month. I borrowed that book. She didn't see hiding her hair of me for.
it only
for
took you a
month or
month
so.
to read it?
Yeah, I
He
was
blasted
I
through it.
blasted.
Holy
it.
Wow, that's impressive. That's impressive.
But yeah, so the idea of theistic evolution, I can't say absolutely how God did all this, how how God worked out, whether creation was actually 6 days. I certainly believe that because I think that's what the Bible teaches. Scientifically, I can't prove that. I can't, completely defend that. Age of the Earth is again another thing that I think there's some evidence on both sides. And so scientifically, I can't prove it. I can't say absolutely.
How does the theistic evolution handle the missing links, where that one particular age, which I don't remember, where all of those?
So like the Cambrian
Cambrian
explosion and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the Bible says it was all created. God created all of them at the beginning, right?
Mhm.
Creation. So that pretty much explains that. There's not much else to that. Scientists and whatnot, their explanations for that is kind of why they now don't believe in a single tree of universal common descent, because of events like that, where there's sudden explosions of life and missing links everywhere. They actually don't
Not
have,
just life, but variety of life.
Oh yeah, and they don't have like they. You guys, I think, had it growing up. It wasn't in our textbooks. They had the different species progressing the charts, whatever it was called, and then they ended up, the guy had made that up, so they took it out. There's not a continuous link from species to species to species to species. They say that there's commonality between species, and so that's where they get their idea of evolution, growing survival of the fittest, but there's no continual chain of that from, for example, monkeys to humans. There's no link. They say they find all these different hominid skeletons throughout the world, like Lucy and whatnot. What they actually found, and then what they don't tell you, is they only find 3 bones or pieces of bones. The rest of them are washed down the hill, and when they do find them, it's only a small fraction of the entire skeleton, and they're making this assumption that, this ape, this is a intermediary between a human and an ape, but they don't even have all the bones. They have only tiny pieces of them, and they don't actually have good links. They're making assumptions and theories off of these finds.
And quite often, the next find disproves what they had just hypothesized previously. Yeah.
Well,
different ages now.
if they have a variety of trees, so to speak, is that assuming then there's different spontaneous life forms, so that they would have different DNA characteristics? I mean, would it come from that single one to have all the variety of trees, or would they have multiple singular ones?
For evolution, any kind of evolution, big evolution, to be true, there has to be a common descent.
So there's one that creates.
The idea in trying to explain the Cambrian explosion, they're hypothesizing multiple spontaneous events, but the problem with that is the missing links are, instead of from dogs to cats, it's from bacteria to cats, because they're having these fully developed species, or nearly fully developed species, with absolutely no progenitors whatsoever. And so, like I said, they're going from bacteria to cats, or bacteria to horses.
Not in one step, in a series of steps.
Well, they are. I mean,
in one step, you're saying?
In essence,
they can't explain
it. They're saying that these things just popped up. Okay, so if they have no lineage for that, then there have to be basically from abiogenesis to these species in just a absolutely brief, almost instantaneous progression.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, kind of, and that it didn't answer kind of my question. Then this bacteria, this original DNA, couldn't have done all of those different
Right.
breeds. So are we saying that there's several different instantaneous life from non-life, so that you get the different trees?
In some cases, I think that would have to be the case.
Well, and that's what
they,
they
and
observe.
they don't address that.
Right, yeah, it's just not
They,
even
they
addressed.
don't say that, but the necessary implication is that.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's what they're finding in all of these. So you have, and Cambrian's only one. You have Avalon, Cambrian, the Great Dorfsian, the Devian, Nectune, the Audon. I mean, it goes on and on. There's so many in here. Taras. Address it. This is what we observe, and it's kind of the black sheep per se that evolutionists, paleontologists don't talk about, but it's what they observe. So some of them do talk about it, and that's why they say there may be multiple trees of life.
Now, is it possible to get one DNA from another DNA? It is it? I mean, you can't have the DNA of a cat also have the DNA of an octopus in it, or a piece of grass.
Well, they're implying that you can, and that they diverged through.
Well, so evolution, the whole premise of evolution is that it's adding more information and mutating and continues to add new information onto this DNA structure.
right, and he
Over
asks that
time.
question at the beginning.
Where does that
And yet natural
information
selection.
come from?
Yes, that's the
Indeed.
whole point.
Yeah.
They say it's natural, it's just chance, pure chance. It
Right.
just happened to happen, and that one worked, so it survived or whatever, and then it mutated again and again. But
That's the point that he's making at the beginning of this essay: is can a computer program generate more information than it's given?
what we observe and what all scientists observe is the exact opposite. We don't see new information being added. We only see a reduction in information. The dog example is just one simplistic version of that. If you look at creation as a whole and all the different species and plants and everything, there's so much, but there's only been a reduction. So that's like an upside down tree. But
And that's what we observe.
yeah.
That's the truth of what we observe and we can reproduce. The other is purely speculative.
Yeah, so what we can observe is, at some point like this, if dogs had common ancestor, there was more DNA further on, and now there's less. A good example of that is human breeding. If that's why when travel over the world kind of helps the human population because of inbreeding. And that inbreeding is the perfect example of this. It's the less and less information, and then you have all kinds of problems. Humans, Adam and Eve, their DNA was complete. Or if it's not Adam and Eve, then the people don't believe that, then early ancestors, their DNA was more complete, because as time goes down, information is split and split and split, just like the dogs, and you have less and less information. It never observed new information. And an interesting study or topic in here, they talk about what they identify to be the DNAs, the parts of the DNA that make up the skull in a monkey or an ape. And there's a lot of them, right? Because you have all the flesh, all the different parts of the flesh, the brain, the eyes, the ears, the tongue, everything, the bones, the skins, the muscles, everything, the nerves, all of that, and just the head. I think in there they just used the skull, just the bones for their example. What they've observed, how long it takes something to mutate. because there are mutations, but it's a mutation of something that's already there. It's into something less different, but it's not new. They're taking information off of this. What they've observed, how long that takes, if they were to apply that time frame for that one gene to change, I don't want to say mutate because it's a change, it's a mutation, but it's not new information. It's like taking, in the beginning, God created, and then the mutation is in the beginning. It's less information. If they take that time frame for just that to happen, for that one gene, and apply it to the other genes that make up their whole skull and all this stuff, there's not enough time since the Big Bang for that to happen. Let alone everything else in the head. And then the body, and then the species, and then the interspecies. From beginning, it's the numbers, it just doesn't make sense. It's impossible.
Yeah, there's one, David Berlinski did a study on supposedly the, like camel is a relative of the whale. I don't remember exactly how they got there or whatever. But anyway, he talked about the number of changes that will be required and the time frame that they say that occurred. And I did some additional math on that and came up with, if everything worked out, perfectly and in sequence and, given the benefit of the doubt, it would require a mutation in the reproductive cells once every 4 days in a population that has a reproductive lifespan of 5 years. So, the number of changes that were required in this time frame were, we'd have to have a new generation every 4 days. And these species takes 2 or 3 years to mature to the point of reproductive age. And so, the implication is that that's, 300 times the required time. And so, it's just, again, just absurd. Absurdity on absurdity upon absurdity. Make any sense at all?
No.
You look confused.
Basically, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the time required from what they observed to go from species to species is there's not enough time.
Right.
Mhm.
And I think that was the point he was making in this essay. It's just
Well, they always compare us to apes, but they might as well compare us to a blade of grass.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Well, I know that evolution doesn't come up too often in conversations with unbelievers, but hopefully this has shed some light on why evolution isn't like the best explanation for life and the world that we see around us. I don't want to eat into too far to the sweaters and sweets because I can hear everybody's outside already. But there were a few housekeeping things that we need to address before we adjourn. One is what our last reading will be before we go on break, and the other is to consider what we want to look at, study for next term in January. I would be happy to continue reading this. I mean, we've only done 15 out of the 50 essays, so we've got material to cover, much more time if you'd like to do that. If no decision is made, I brought the Cold Case Christianity if you wanted to take a look at it. I haven't read that book cover to cover, but I do know that it's good material. That's the 10th anniversary updated and revised version, and it came with a lot of additional material, handouts, videos, things like that we can use in Defenders. So that's a good candidate, good option. We certainly don't have to do that one. If there are other studies or other books or other subjects that you guys would be interested, I'm certainly open to that. Theistic evolution is one. I would also be I should put this out there, I'd also be very open to returning to material that we've done before, like On Guard and Tactics. So if you'd like to redo Tactics or On Guard, that's certainly an option as well. So
I don't know what On Guard is, but Tactics, I'm reading that because you guys told me about that. So I'm open to Tactics, I'm open to this, and I'm open to continuing. So I'm open to 3 options. I don't know where you feel.
yeah, and we don't have to make the decision right away.
But we do definitely by next week.
Um,
And the easy reading, it's got good supporting people,
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one thing to consider with Cold Case Christianity is that the supporting materials that it came with, it calls them sessions. There's 30 of them. So if we were to do 30 sessions, like 1 session per week, that's the better part of the year. I mean, we would be doing like 15 weeks in the spring, and then maybe take a break for the summer, and then another 15 weeks in the fall or something. Or we could do 2 sessions per week and just do it all in one term, so that we're not locked down to this one book.
Or we could do selective sessions.
Yeah, or we could do just like we're doing now with Evidence for God, where we just kind of bounce around. That's
Well, can you
certainly
do that
too.
with that book? Doesn't one build on the other each
Um,
premise or something like that? Because these were
possibly.
independent.
Yeah, these are fully independent. That's true. I don't know that there would probably be some material that has prerequisite reading, but I would need to take a closer look at the video and the handouts, because I don't know that they follow the book from beginning to end, and I think it also references other material. But we don't have to make that decision right now. Just food for thought. If you want to take a look at it, just think about it.
I'm gonna assume the fact that there'll be more people next time.
Hopefully.
Well, I've enjoyed this, whether there's 1 or 2 of us or not. Can they pick up on this? Will they be
Oh,
able
I
to
think so.
join us?
Well, especially since these are all fully independent essays. I think so.
This has been interesting. It's forced me to think. My
That's good.
problem is I don't retain it real well. That's why I like the thought of tactics, because we'd be repeating and we'd be going over these techniques. Because remember I was saying about role playing.
Yeah.
Separate.
Just as a reminder, all of the tactics, classes that we did in the spring of this year are on defendersapologetics.org.
Okay, I need to look at
If you
that.
want to take a look at that, yeah.
All right. So what are we going to do next week? Our last week.
Why don't you pick? We've been picking. Why don't you choose this time?
Why don't I choose this
I'm not sure
time?
that my choice last week was the most.
I think it was good. It was certainly edifying for me.
It was different. But
Yeah, it was different. It was interesting. Very interesting.
All right, here's one that's standing out to me. Archaeology in the Bible. How archaeological findings have enhanced the credibility of the Bible.
John McCrae. Yeah, sure.
John McCrae, how does that sound to you guys?
Sounds good to me.
Sounds great.
All
We
right,
can do that one.
that's the one we're going to do.
Okay.
Right on. Looking forward to it. Well, hopefully I haven't taken too much time away from sweaters and sweets. I can hear everybody's out there is like, oh no, I don't want to
Huh?
just
All right.
chomp through that and nobody gets a chance to
Yeah.
participate. All right, archaeology and the Bible. We'll do that one next week. Looking forward to it.
Therefore, pray. Break up.
Yes, let's pray before we.
Dear God, we just come before you now, and we just pray that you would give us wisdom to know how to use the knowledge that you've given us. It says that knowledge puffs up and love builds up. God, just help us to have the right attitude, to use these tools you've given us in the right way, to edify and to encourage and to cause people to think and cause people to be drawn to you, and not to just use them for esoteric arguments to win a prideful argument, and help us to have your heart towards people as we use this information. God, I'm just so thankful for the way that you've created us, the way that you've allowed us to process information and to just to be able to ponder your greatness through all of this information. And just pray that we would use that in the right way. Thank you for John and his diligence and his hard work in presenting this. And we just thank you for the opportunity to learn. Pray this all through Christ. Amen.
Amen.
And Randy as well.
Yeah.
Randy's-
I guess.